What is my opinion on open relationships, polyamory, other forms of non-monogamy? First of all, I think casual sex is a contradiction in terms. I don't think there's anything about sex that's casual.
You tell me, what's more of an embarrassment to conservatives? The sexual politics of Donald Trump, who seems to take pride in being caught with his pants down, especially when it's women who've had extensive plastic surgery and have appeared nude in widely known magazines, or the sexual politics of somebody like Jordan Peterson, who in some ways is more of an authentic conservative, but in other ways is more of a laughable prude and makes your whole movement seem out of touch with reality, in as much as any of these people can be construed as members of any movement. I don't remember Donald Trump getting on the streets and protesting for a goddamn thing in the 10 years before he became president. I don't remember being a member of any movement, now that I think about it, let alone a leader of a movement. Yeah, funny that. Same with Jordan Peterson. I remember Jordan Peterson making a lot of really lame appearances on TV Ontario. Anyway, so look guys, I'm going to cut to a 6-minute clip here. A clip of Jordan Peterson, and then separately a clip about Jordan Peterson. You get to see what his position is on this, and I'm going to follow up my commentary in a few.
He essentially says that sort of monogamy should be enforced, and everybody needs to like men need to be delivered sex, and so she was like, doesn't that sort of like contradict your sort of non-compulsory politics? And he's just like, this is an exception.
Societies seem to function better, that is, less violently, let's say, when there's one woman per man. If there's many women per man, there aren't many women for every man. There are a handful of men, let's say, a minority of men, a Pareto distribution of men who have a disproportionate number of women, and a lot of men who have none, and those aren't happy men, let's put it that way. They're men who are very likely to get up to no good very rapidly.
Violent attacks are what happens when men do not have partners, right. Mr. Peterson says, and society needs to work to make sure those men are married.
Is it?
Yeah, no one who's married has ever raped anyone.
He was angry at God because women were rejecting him, Mr. Peterson says of the Toronto killer. The cure for that is enforced monogamy. What? That's why monogamy, I don't even understand that.
That's not very libertarian.
But wait a second, he's not talking about enforced monogamy. He's talking about enforced mating.
Well, this is a further quote. He said, but aside from interventions that would redistribute sex, Mr. Peterson is staunchly against what he calls equality of outcomes in an effort to equalize society. He usually calls them pathologically evil.
Wow.
What is my opinion on open relationships, polyamory, other forms of non-monogamy? Well, I think that as a medium to long-term strategy, they're completely untenable, because human beings, as far as I'm concerned, are fundamentally pair bonding. And, if you're just talking about casual sex, first of all, I think casual sex is a contradiction in terms. I don't think there's anything about sex that's casual, and I think that people are deceiving themselves badly whenever they think so. They might like to live in a 1970s Playboy adolescent fantasy, but I've never seen that work under any circumstances whatsoever, and I think people get hurt badly.
Wow. Otherwise, women will only go for the most high status men. But that's not enforced monogamy. Is you somehow must pair up with one.
Well, he's conflating that. Exactly. He's synchronizing.
It would have a knock-on effect. It would have a knock-on effect. What's you don't understand knock-on effect?
He's conflating two things. First, every man needs to have sex or it's dangerous, and then they need to be married, and marriage there needs to be enforced monogamy. That's what he's saying.
Okay, but the enforced monogamy is a second order issue. That's whether or not your wife is going to cheat on you.
He's suggesting that
he's saying there needs to be enforced mating.
Yeah, but he's saying we can get there if we have societal pressures towards monogamy, because then the alpha males are taking up less of the women, that sort of thing.
Oh, I see. So the enforcement is on the men. You can only sleep with one woman at a time.
Yeah, it's like a maximum income, but for sex.
To sleep around casually is to imply that sex is casual. To imply that sex is casual is to assume implicitly that it can be divorced from the rest of life, emotional life, motivational life, values, all of that. And you can divorce it, but you pay a big price for that. I think the price you pay is like the virtual. Well, the word psychopathic keeps leaping to mind. Yeah, good old Freud. You have to reduce a person to the casual pleasure of a transient sexual interaction in order to sleep around casually. And I think that once you establish that as a habit with sex, which is a deep experience, if you'll do that with sex, which is a deep experience, then, and you learn how, then what makes you think that won't transfer to everything else that you do? I mean, sometimes they're open people and they're creative and they're exploratory and all of that, and fair enough, but often they're just unconscientious and they don't want to take any responsibility, and they want to live in this wish fulfillment fantasy where everybody can have all the sex they want all the time and it's always wonderful and no one gets hurt. And it's like, sorry, that just doesn't work in the real world.
Jordan Peterson, that's a bold move to be like, oh, redistributive tax policies, that's Soviet. On the other hand, we literally need to legislate.
I was simply trying to fix the culture in many ways.
Nothing far right about that. God.
I'm not far right. Don't mischaracterize me.
I just want to have a fascist rape state, that's all.
What you call a fascist rape state, I call monogamy.
I think they're just unbelievable. Contagious Chameleon, what do you think the implications are? I mean, the argument here, though, okay, let's say there are not any high status males who are available at that time. The implication is like the women are still going to have sex with like the Jordan Petersons
Yeah, exactly.
of the world.
Exactly.
Exactly.
They'll need it. And then you'll be, who's laughing now?
Who's laughing now, Sam?
You might think this is the easiest sort of video for me to make, as opposed to a video that's about like the history of the Cambodian genocide, but it's actually the most difficult for me because it's about 6 different issues at the same time. I prefer to deal with one issue in a focused manner, whether that's the Cambodian genocide or some other disaster or what have you. So many things spring to mind on this. First and foremost is I think that Jordan Peterson's whole position is built on a misconception about what open relationships entail when you scale them up socially, on a social. Of course, it's also true he has misconceptions of what it means for just one person in isolation. Now, if the problem being faced by incels, by people living in involuntary celibacy, if the problem really were a scarcity of available women, which it is not. I mean, patently, if you just read their own statements on the internet, the problem isn't that there are no women. Not even in Alaska and so on do people phrase the problem this way. Anyway, sorry. There are some incredibly remote areas of the world where you live in a mining site or you're in the military and there are just no women around. There are some situations, where the gender balance is way off. But with that aside, on a social scale, on a national scale, nobody, not even the guys who are struggling with involuntary celibacy, say that it's scarcity of females. But if it were, just ask yourself this question honestly. How often do you hear about women who have been taken off the market, who are not really available in this way because of disability, because of a drinking habit, because of alcoholism? So look, I'm from Canada. I used to live in Scotland. Alcoholism is at epidemic proportions in these countries. I remember a government report. I shouldn't even say it. It was really like an anti-government report. It was a criticism of government policy, pointing out that the government was spending vastly more money dealing with the AIDS crisis than it was dealing with alcoholism. But actually, in a country like Canada, alcoholism and even specifically fetal alcohol syndrome, these were much larger problems, much larger concerns. You see that right now? What are the odds that siren you just heard going past the background is alcohol related? Alcoholism, drug addiction, obesity. There are a lot of women who are, And, I see some of them at my gym. We have some really morbidly obese people trying to get in shape, obviously, at my gym and so on. There are huge numbers of people who are off the market in this sense due to drug addiction, even gambling, major social problems we all hear about. And that, frankly, you probably have relatives you've heard about going through these things. People who are not dating or not getting married or not settling down and having kids because of serious health problems, psychological problems, what have you. And, of course, the mother of all these problems, the mother of all sociological problems is poverty, right? There are women who are in no situation to date or start a family because of poverty. So these are factors that have taken, if you look at it from Jordan Peterson's perspective, if you look at it as if the fundamental problem is there are a lot of men trying to settle down and get married and there just aren't enough women for them to compete for, I think any sincere person in the Canadian context, in the Scottish context, or many others would say, these are the kinds of factors. Now, of course, if you even just ask the women involved, like, it's the problem that there are so many men wanting to settle down, get married, and have kids, and there are enough women for them. I don't think anyone perceives the problem this way. And again, even the incels themselves, the guys who have these websites discussing involuntary celibacy, that's not how they perceive the problem. So he's starting off, he's not just posing a false solution. It's a false solution to a false problem. But stick with this for a minute. If you know people in open relationships, if you know people who practice polyamory, or if you just know people who, in the parlance of our times, fuck around, do they really take large numbers of people off the open market permanently? I've lived in many countries around the world, and I mean, a large number of these countries, it is completely normal for married couples to have other partners, to sleep with people other than the person they're married to. Have you heard of far off, distant, and exotic France? Really, French culture. Think about extramarital sex in French culture. Have you heard of Thailand? In China, there's a lot of emphasis on celibacy and having few sexual partners before you get married. But then once you get married, it's a much more permissive culture. Their concept of fealty in the marriage, it's not Christian, right? In all these cultures, I mean, if you think about the stereotypical French relationship, and several prime ministers of France were in these types of relationships, and it's been talked about in newspapers and what have you, especially by people who aren't from France, especially from outsiders looking in, and how differently the French regard extramarital affairs from the way Bill Clinton was regarded in the United States. Common topic of conversation. The stereotypical situation is that the given French man has a wife he's married to and having kids with, and then there's some other woman on the side who he has some kind of affair with. Do you really think that other woman is off the market? Do you think she stops? I mean, look, if she wants to get married and have kids, and not everybody does, do you think she stops looking for a man to get married to and have kids with, like, permanently? Really? It's just ridiculous. The vast majority of open relationships. Let's keep it all the way real here. I would encourage you, and I would encourage Jordan Peterson, and I would encourage the hosts of the Majority Report show. Shout out to them. Thanks for letting me use the clips. I would encourage all of these people to be in open relationships at all times. And the reason for that, actually, is, in a weird sense, is not sex. It's because if you want a relationship to last forever, if you want to have permanence and durability in the relationship, I think you have to face up to, accept, and embrace the extent to which, the merely biological desire for sex and things like human curiosity is really something very short-term and fleeting. If you go into a relationship with the attitude, either this person has 100% fealty to me, or the minute they slip up, the minute they sleep with someone else, it's over, I'm never talking to you again. Well, either you're setting yourself up for disaster, which many people do. You're setting down ground rules that will foretell the end of the relationship sooner or later. Because if it's a long enough relationship, if you're together 30 years, look, guys, we're a bunch of bipedal monkeys. We're not angels trapped in human form. We're really not. And before proceeding further with this lowbrow commentary on one of the most important social issues of our time, let me just throw in a little piece of jargon and say that I think Jordan Peterson's whole worldview here is based on a false dichotomy. This happens a lot of the time in politics. People talk about healthcare And they present it as if either you have 100% coverage universal health care or you have 100% free market coverage. And the reality is most of the real world examples we can look at, including Canada, even including Taiwan, are a really weird mix of government control and free market elements. Universal health care is never universal, blah, blah, blah. But it's very easy to stand behind a podium and present this to an audience as if there are two and only two mutually exclusive examples that are at diametrically opposed extremes. And that's what Jordan Peterson is doing here at every stage of the argument when he attacks the concept of casual sex. Okay, so you want to pillory and insult this terminus, this point on the extreme on the spectrum, and you want to contrast it to the opposite extreme of monogamous, intensely meaningful, long-term, high-commitment sex. Well, there really is a spectrum of values here, and God damn it, if this guy has actually worked as a therapist, he must have had people coming into his practice who were in monogamous long-term marriages and who found their sex completely meaningless and couldn't get along with their husband or wife at all. Come on! The fact that you're in a monogamous committed relationship doesn't mean you have great sex. It doesn't mean you have meaningful sex. And someone in his position ought to know that. Anyway, but there's a whole range of things here. And I think it's really important to reject this kind of false dichotomy and face up to the values that are somewhere in the middle. What if sex doesn't have to be either a dirty, despicable, disposable treatment of one human being, one human being using the other as a disposable short-term source of gratification, as I think Jordan Peterson eloquently insults everyone's intelligence by saying, what if it doesn't have to either be that or the opposite extreme? What if it's possible for your sex life with people other than your primary partner to be about as meaningful as a skiing trip? I mean, what if you have relationships with these people that are to some extent meaningful and involve some kind of mutual knowledge, mutual awareness, mutual cooperation, some common interests, some mutual respect, something you put some real effort and interest in? Maybe a skiing trip wasn't the best possible example I could have thought of. Maybe I should have said something like visiting the pyramids in Egypt. When I think of an undertaking like that, it's a significant amount of time. It's a significant amount of effort. It's something you're going to remember for the rest of your life, even if it's shallow, even if it's disappointing. I mean, I don't think going to visit the pyramids in Egypt or when I rode my bicycle across, the plains of northeastern Thailand and visited ruins of ancient Buddhist monuments and saw stone inscriptions, it's shallow. The first time I saw the Mekong River, it meant a lot to me, and I remember for the rest of my life. But yeah, it's shallow. It's not as meaningful as falling in love, getting married, and having a baby. But it's also not something at the despicable opposite end of the scale. You can do things with your time and energy where you pour in a certain amount of effort, preparation, imagination. You get to know other people. You have meaningful connections. And yes, you do remember it for the rest of your life. Maybe you create friendships that last the rest of your life too as a consequence. Maybe not. But the idea that this is something fleeting, that this is a matter of treating other human beings as disposable and you being discarded and treated as disposable in itself, I don't think that's any more ineluctably true for sexual relations than it is for ski trips or making a pilgrimage to see the pyramids in Egypt or putting your feet in the Mekong River and feeling that you're getting in touch with something, whether it's history, art, politics, some kind of meaningful connection to the outside world. Honestly, I think it's a lot easier to have a meaningful connection to another human being than it is to have a connection to a piece of rock or just a view of a landscape. I'm really anti-skiing, I've got to tell you. And one of the differences between sex and skiing is that skiing is way more likely to kill you, way more likely to break your ankle, way more likely to result in brain damage. Hashtag Sonny Bono. But, that aside, one thing that sex and skiing have in common is that both are way more dangerous when there's alcohol involved. I'd say also they're way more dangerous when there's self-deception involved. If you think you're better at skiing than you are, then you take risks that you shouldn't. And this is probably true about sex and the human ego in many other ways. But look, fundamentally, we're a frail breed of bipedal monkey. And we're a lot better adapted for finding ways to love each other finding ways to build friendships and meaningful relationships. And yeah, you know what? We really do have this fundamental impulse to relate to one another sexually, and you can learn a lot out of that. You can have a lot of meaningful relationships in your life with more than just one person, especially if you're talking about over a period of decades of long-term relationships. And it doesn't have to be one extreme or the other. So it's sort of to understand the next and final point I'm making here, you have to understand that I'm rejecting both aspects of Professor Peterson's reasoning. I'm both rejecting the idea that open relationships lead to some kind of nationwide scarcity of available women. And then secondly, I'm rejecting the idea that anything other than marriage is dirty, despicable, is one person reducing another to being a disposable means for their short-term gratification. I mean, it happens. It happens. But I mean, how difficult or easy would it be to challenge the image of marriage she's presenting? Do you really think there are no marriages where people don't treat each other terribly? I mean, that's out there too, right? Anyway, sorry. But this is kind of like a caricature built on top of a caricature. So come back to the point I was making before, and we close on this. We're not angels who are trapped in human form. And I mean, that idea, it's actually older than Christianity. Sorry, I've got some ancient Greek philosophy here on the table. I was reading Porphyry. It's remarkable to me that pre-Christian Greek philosophy still contains this idea that the soul is trapped in the human body and is trying to escape, and the soul is just ever so rational and virtuous, but it's dragged down to this earth by petty desires, and how terrible and despicable these desires are. Look, if you can get a little bit comfortable with the fact that flesh and blood, skin and bones is all we've got, that we are after all biological entities. We're not only biological entities. We can aspire to do all kinds of wonderful, altruistic, and creative things with our lives in our time. But that is what we're made of. And that's not a fleshy prison we're trying to escape. That's the only vehicle we've got to take us through this life. And when that vehicle breaks down and stops running, that's the end of it for all of us. If we can embrace our own limitations and mortality, I think we can at the same time appreciate that human curiosity and conviviality and warmth and love and respect and friendship, these are things naturally bundled up with sexual instincts. Probably if you have a coworker of the opposite sex that you admire in all these ways, there's probably a little bit of that sexual attraction bundled up in there. And that's not necessarily an evil and despicable thing you have to repress and expurgate. And again, Jordan Peterson, this is his field. This is a field in so many ways created by Sigmund Freud. He gave a shout out to. You'd think if anyone on earth were comfortable with the contradictions we all have to live with in taking, a medieval set of moral expectations, a medieval set of social institutions, and dragging them into the modern era and reconciling them with our awareness of who we are biologically and maybe who we aspire to be philosophically. Maybe we want to be something more than just a hairless bipedal ape. Maybe we want to do something better. Guys, more is possible than this. Don't be a prisoner of this kind of ridiculous reductionistic syllogistic reasoning that presents you with only these two diametrically opposed opposites, one of which is pure and one of which is impure. You can be warm and accepting and loving of your primary partner, and you can maybe recognize, especially if they haven't already been with 1,000 partners before they got with you, if they're not already just burnt out on human sexuality and have no more curiosity or capacity to get with others. You can set aside those feelings of possession and jealousy and control and revenge, and you're actually not harming your primary partner. You're not harming others. You're definitely not depriving the Jordan Petersons of this world. You're not taking anyone off the market. At the end of the day, the free market we all have to deal with is the free market of ideas. It's trying to find other people who find the same things meaningful that we find meaningful, finding ways to share our lives with them. And yeah, TBH, sex is part of that.